Number 1. The Golden State Killer. Decades of terror ended by a family tree. For more than 4 decades, a series of rapes and murders committed across California between 1974 and 1986 remained one of the most notorious unsolved cases in American history, attributed to a perpetrator known by various names including the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and ultimately the Golden State Killer. The crime spanned multiple counties and involved dozens of confirmed sexual assaults and at least 13 murders, terrorizing communities across the state for years and leaving investigators with extensive physical evidence but no identity to attach to it. Detectives across multiple jurisdictions had long suspected the cases were connected based on similarities in method, but it was not until advances in DNA technology decades later that a definitive link was established between crime scenes that had previously been investigated separately. The case remained dormant for years, with DNA profiles from crime scenes entered into law enforcement databases without producing a match to any known offender. The breakthrough came through a technique known as forensic genetic genealogy, in which investigators uploaded a DNA profile derived from crime scene evidence to a public genealogy database, the kind typically used by people researching their family ancestry. This allowed investigators to identify distant relatives of the unknown suspect based on shared genetic markers, and from there to construct a family tree that progressively narrowed the pool of possible suspects. Investigators used traditional genealogical research methods, including public records, to trace the family tree forward and identify living individuals who fit the profile based on age, location, and other circumstantial factors. This process led investigators to Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer living in Citrus Heights, California, who had been discharged from law enforcement decades earlier following a shoplifting arrest. To confirm the match without alerting D'Angelo to the investigation, detectives covertly obtained a discarded item containing his DNA, which was then compared to the crime scene evidence and produced a match. D'Angelo was arrested in April 2018 at his home, more than 4 decades after his first known crimes. Given the scale of the case, prosecutors across multiple California counties coordinated a single plea agreement in which D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and kidnapping-related charges in 2020, while also admitting to numerous additional uncharged rapes for which the statute of limitations had expired. He was sentenced to multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The case became the most prominent example of forensic genetic genealogy's potential to solve cold cases, and it triggered a wave of similar investigations across the United States in the years that followed, as well as significant public debate about the privacy implications of using consumer genealogy databases for criminal investigations. Number 2. The Phantom of Heilbronn. A DNA trail that led nowhere and everywhere. In one of the most bizarre cases in the history of forensic DNA analysis, investigators in Germany, Austria, and France spent years pursuing a phantom suspect whose DNA had been found at dozens of crime scenes spanning a remarkable range of offenses, from minor burglaries to a murder of a police officer in Heilbronn, Germany in 2007. The DNA profile, found at crime scenes across multiple countries over a period of more than a decade, suggested the existence of a single female perpetrator with an extraordinary and seemingly impossible range of criminal activity and mobility. The case consumed enormous investigative resources, with police forces across 3 countries coordinating efforts to identify this elusive suspect, whom media outlets dubbed the Phantom of Heilbronn. The investigation eventually took an unexpected turn when investigators began to question whether the DNA evidence itself might be the source of the anomaly rather than reflecting an actual perpetrator. Forensic scientists determined that the cotton swabs used to collect DNA samples at numerous crime scenes across the affected countries had been manufactured at a single factory and had been contaminated during the manufacturing process by DNA from a female factory worker who had no connection whatsoever to any of the crimes. The swabs, despite being packaged as sterile, had been contaminated before they ever reached crime scenes, meaning that the DNA evidence that had driven years of investigation was an artifact of the collection process rather than evidence left by an actual offender. This revelation, confirmed in 2009, required investigators to re-examine numerous cases where this contaminated DNA had been treated as significant evidence, and it became one of the most cited cautionary examples in forensic science regarding the critical importance of quality control and chain of custody procedures in evidence collection. While the case did not result in the conviction the DNA evidence initially seemed to promise, its resolution was itself a significant achievement in forensic investigation, demonstrating the rigor that modern forensic science applies even to its own findings, And it led to substantial reforms in evidence collection protocols across European law enforcement agencies regarding the sourcing and handling of DNA collection materials. Number 3. The Grim Sleeper. A killer identified through his son's DNA. For more than 2 decades, a serial killer operated in South Los Angeles, murdering primarily young black women and leaving long gaps between killings that led investigators to dub him the Grim Sleeper, based on an apparent 14-year pause in his pattern of crimes between 1988 and 2002. The case involved at least 10 confirmed murders and additional attempted murders dating back to 1985, and for years the case received what many community members and advocates argued was insufficient attention from law enforcement and media given the demographics of the victims. DNA evidence had been collected from multiple crime scenes over the years, but without a suspect to compare it to, the profile sat in law enforcement databases without producing a match. The breakthrough in the case came through an investigative technique known as familial DNA searching, in which investigators search a DNA database not for an exact match to the crime scene profile but for a close partial match that would indicate a close biological relative of the perpetrator. This technique, which California was among the first states to formally authorize for use in criminal investigations, produced a partial match to a man who had been convicted of an unrelated felony offense and whose DNA was therefore in the state's offender database. Investigators determined that this man's DNA profile was too similar to the crime scene evidence to be the perpetrator himself, given other case details, but consistent with being a close relative, specifically a son of the actual perpetrator. This led investigators to the man's father, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., a former Los Angeles Police Department garage attendant and city sanitation worker. To obtain a direct DNA sample from Franklin without alerting him, undercover officers posed as restaurant workers and collected a discarded piece of pizza and a soda can he had used while under surveillance. The DNA from these items matched the crime scene evidence from multiple murders. Franklin was arrested in July 2010. He was tried and convicted in 2016 on multiple counts of first-degree murder and attempted murder, and he was sentenced to death. He died on death row in California in 2020 of natural causes before his sentence could be carried out. The case was one of the most prominent examples of familial DNA searching successfully solving a cold case, and it also prompted significant discussion about the historical pattern of underinvestigation in cases involving victims from marginalized communities, a pattern that advocacy groups had highlighted throughout the years the case remained unsolved. Number 4. The BTK Killer. A floppy disk and a daughter's pap smear. Dennis Rader, who called himself BTK, an acronym he used referring to his method of binding, torturing, and killing his victims, committed a series of murders in and around Wichita, Kansas, beginning in 1974 and continuing intermittently through the 1990s, while also sending taunting communications to police and media throughout this period, sometimes including details about his crimes that had not been publicly disclosed. The case went cold for years after his apparent communications stopped in the 1990s, and many investigators believed the killer might be dead or incarcerated for unrelated offenses. The case was reactivated in 2004 when communications resumed, with Rader sending a series of letters, packages, and other materials to media outlets, apparently driven by a desire for recognition that ultimately proved to be his undoing. In one communication, Rader asked police, through a media intermediary, whether a floppy disk could be traced if he used one to send a message, and police, working with media outlets under their direction, responded untruthfully that it could not be traced. Rader subsequently sent a floppy disk containing a message, and forensic analysis of the disk's metadata revealed it had last been saved on a computer at a church, and further metadata contained a reference to a name, Dennis, that was associated with the church's computer network. This led investigators to focus on Dennis Rader, a Wichita resident who had worked in code enforcement for the city and who, remarkably, had previously had some level of community standing including involvement with his local church and a Boy Scout troop. To confirm the identification, investigators obtained a court order for a pap smear sample that had been taken from Rader's adult daughter at a university health clinic, without her knowledge of the reason for the request. The DNA from this sample, due to the biological relationship between parent and child, was compared to crime scene evidence from the BTK murders and confirmed a familial match consistent with Rader being the perpetrator. Rader was arrested in February 2005. He pleaded guilty later that year to 10 counts of murder, providing chillingly detailed accounts of his crimes during his plea hearing, and he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences. The case remains one of the most studied examples of how digital metadata, combined with familial DNA analysis, can break open a case that had gone cold for years, and it has been extensively discussed in forensic science and criminal justice education regarding both the offender's psychological profile and the specific investigative techniques that led to his identification. Number 5. The Boston Strangler. A match confirmed decades after the crimes. Between 1962 and 1964, a series of murders of women in the Boston area, primarily involving sexual assault and strangulation, terrorized the city and became known collectively as the work of the Boston Strangler. Albert DeSalvo confessed to the murders while incarcerated for unrelated sexual assault offenses, but he was never tried for the stranglings, in part due to a legal agreement related to his confession and in part because he was murdered in prison in 1973 before any trial could occur. For decades afterward, questions persisted among researchers, family members of victims, and some investigators about whether DeSalvo had actually committed all of the murders attributed to him, with some theories suggesting multiple perpetrators might have been responsible for crimes that were grouped together under a single narrative due to their similarities and the climate of fear in Boston at the time. In 2013, investigators reopened the case of Mary Sullivan, the final victim attributed to the Boston Strangler, using modern DNA analysis techniques on evidence that had been preserved from the original crime scene. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from a water bottle discarded by a nephew of Albert DeSalvo, whose DNA would share familial markers with DeSalvo's own profile due to their biological relationship. This familial DNA comparison produced a match consistent with Albert DeSalvo's DNA profile being present at the Mary Sullivan crime scene. To obtain definitive confirmation, authorities exhumed DeSalvo's remains and extracted a direct DNA sample, which was then compared to the crime scene evidence and confirmed an exact match. This 2013 confirmation provided the first direct forensic evidence definitively linking DeSalvo to at least one of the Boston Strangler murders, nearly 50 years after the crime occurred and 40 years after DeSalvo's own death, resolving for Mary Sullivan's family decades of uncertainty about who had killed their relative, even as questions about some of the other attributed murders have continued to be discussed by researchers given that DeSalvo was never tried or convicted for any of the stranglings during his lifetime. Number 6. The Green River Killer. A saliva sample from a 1987 investigation. Gary Ridgway committed dozens of murders of women and girls in the Seattle, Washington area beginning in 1982, with many of the victims being young women involved in street-based sex work, a victim population that, as in several other cases on this list, investigators have acknowledged received less investigative attention initially than might otherwise have been the case. Ridgway had actually been investigated as a suspect as early as 1983 and had taken a polygraph test in connection with the investigation, which he passed, and he had also been included among individuals from whom investigators collected saliva samples in 1987 as part of an effort to obtain DNA profiles that could be compared against future evidence using technology that, at the time, was still relatively new to forensic science. These samples were preserved but, given the technological limitations and the sheer volume of samples collected relative to the resources available for analysis, were not immediately processed against all available crime scene evidence. The case remained open for years, with the killings having apparently stopped or significantly decreased by the mid-1980s, leading some investigators to wonder whether the perpetrator had died, been incarcerated for an unrelated offense, or simply stopped. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, as DNA technology advanced significantly and the King County Sheriff's Office secured additional resources for cold case investigation, the preserved 1987 saliva sample from Ridgway was analyzed using updated techniques and compared against DNA evidence recovered from multiple Green River victim crime scenes. The analysis produced matches linking Ridgway's DNA to several of the murders. Ridgway was arrested in November 2001. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Ridgway entered into a plea agreement in 2003 in which he agreed to provide detailed information about the locations of additional victims' remains in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment rather than execution. He ultimately pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder, making him one of the most prolific confirmed serial killers in American history, with investigators believing the actual number of his victims may be higher. The case illustrated both the long timeline that can separate the collection of forensic evidence from its eventual use in solving a case, and the significant evolution of DNA technology over the roughly 14 years between sample collection and the analysis that ultimately produced a match. Number 7. The I-65 Killer. A cold case solved through a national database match. Between 1987 and 1990, a series of murders occurred at hotels located near Interstate 65 in Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee, with the killings sharing enough similarities in method that investigators in the affected jurisdictions eventually came to believe they were connected, leading to the case becoming known informally as the I-65 killings. The case went cold for decades, with DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes entered into the National DNA Database but producing no match for years. The case was reactivated in the 2010s as part of a broader cold case review effort, and investigators used forensic genetic genealogy techniques, similar to those that would later be used in other prominent cold cases, to develop leads based on the crime scene DNA profile. Genetic genealogy research pointed investigators toward a man named Harry Edward Greenwell, who had died in 2013 without ever having been identified as a suspect during his lifetime. To confirm the identification posthumously, investigators obtained DNA samples from Greenwell's surviving family members and ultimately exhumed his remains to obtain a direct comparison sample. The DNA from Greenwell's remains was compared to the crime scene evidence from the I-65 murders and produced a match, providing investigators and victims' families with confirmation of the killer's identity more than 3 decades after the crimes occurred, even though Greenwell could never face prosecution due to his death. The case was notable both as an example of forensic genetic genealogy's application to a multi-state cold case and as an illustration of how such techniques can provide resolution to families even in cases where the perpetrator cannot be brought to trial, a form of closure that investigators and prosecutors increasingly recognize as valuable in its own right even when traditional criminal justice outcomes are no longer possible. Number 8. The Bear Brook murders. Identifying victims through DNA when no suspect existed. In 1985 and again in 2000, the remains of 4 individuals, primarily believed to be a woman and 3 young girls, were discovered in barrels in Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire, but for decades investigators were unable to identify either the victims or any suspect, a case that presented the unusual challenge of having physical evidence but no names at all on either side of the crime. The case remained one of New Hampshire's most haunting unsolved mysteries for over 3 decades. Investigators eventually used forensic genetic genealogy techniques, again uploading DNA profiles to genealogy databases, but in this case the goal was to identify the victims themselves rather than a perpetrator. Through this process, investigators were able to identify the adult female victim and determine that the children, while found together and initially believed to be siblings, were actually the children of different mothers, complicating the case further. The genetic genealogy research eventually connected the victims to a man named Terry Petter Rasmussen, who had used numerous aliases throughout his life and had a documented history of relationships with women and their children who subsequently disappeared in multiple states. Rasmussen had died in 2010 while incarcerated in California for an unrelated murder, having been identified through fingerprint analysis in that case under one of his many aliases before his connection to the Bear Brook victims was established. The genetic genealogy work that identified the Bear Brook victims also helped confirm Rasmussen's connection to additional victims in other states, illustrating how a single individual using multiple false identities across decades and multiple states could be connected through DNA evidence in a way that traditional investigative methods, which rely heavily on identity records that the perpetrator had deliberately falsified, had been unable to achieve. The case remains a significant example of how DNA technology has expanded beyond simply identifying perpetrators to also providing identity and closure for victims who might otherwise have remained permanently unknown. Number 9. The Idaho student murders. A knife sheath and touch DNA. In November 2022, 4 University of Idaho students, Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernadel and Kaylee Goncalves, were found dead in an off-campus residence in Moscow, Idaho, in a case that immediately drew intense national media attention given the brutality of the crime and the lack of an immediately apparent suspect or motive. The investigation initially faced significant public scrutiny over its pace and the limited information released to the public in the weeks following the murders. A critical piece of evidence recovered from the crime scene was a knife sheath found near one of the victims, which investigators determined contained genetic material in the form of touch DNA, meaning DNA deposited through skin contact rather than from blood, saliva, or other bodily fluids that are more commonly the source of forensic DNA evidence. This touch DNA profile was processed and compared against available databases. Investigators developed information connecting the DNA profile to Brian Koberger, a graduate student in criminology at a nearby university, and surveillance footage and cell phone data were used to corroborate the connection to the crime scene and the timeline of the murders. To obtain a direct comparison sample, investigators collected DNA from trash at the home of Koberger's family in Pennsylvania, where he had traveled following the murders, and this sample was compared to the touch DNA from the knife sheath, with investigators reporting a match. Koberger was arrested in December 2022. As of the period covered by available public reporting, the case has proceeded through pretrial legal proceedings, with prosecutors indicating their intention to seek the death penalty. The case has become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent American history, both for the nature of the crime itself and for the role that touch DNA evidence, a relatively advanced forensic technique that can recover genetic material from objects that were merely handled rather than used in ways that leave more traditional biological evidence, played in identifying a suspect within weeks of the crime despite the apparent absence of witnesses or an obvious connection between the victims and the alleged perpetrator. Number 10. The Zodiac Killer Investigation. DNA claims and continuing uncertainty. The case of the Zodiac Killer, who claimed responsibility for multiple murders in Northern California in the late 1960s and sent a series of taunting letters and ciphers to newspapers, has remained officially unsolved for more than 5 decades despite being one of the most extensively investigated cold cases in American history. Unlike the other cases on this list, the Zodiac case has not been definitively solved through DNA evidence, and it is included here specifically to illustrate the limitations and ongoing controversies surrounding DNA evidence in cold case investigation. Over the decades, various DNA samples recovered from envelopes and stamps used to mail the Zodiac letters have been tested using available technology, but the degraded nature of the genetic material, the small quantities involved, and the possibility of contamination from the numerous people who handled the letters and envelopes over the decades since they were originally received have made it difficult to obtain a definitive profile that investigators have confidence accurately represents the killer rather than postal workers, letter recipients, or others who handled the materials. Multiple independent researchers and amateur investigator groups have, at various points, announced what they characterized as DNA matches to specific named suspects, generating significant media attention, but law enforcement agencies including the FBI have generally not confirmed these claims as definitively resolving the case, citing the evidentiary limitations described above. The Zodiac case continues to be the subject of active cold case review by multiple California law enforcement agencies, and it remains a frequently cited example, alongside the successes represented by the other cases in this list, of the genuine limitations of DNA evidence when the biological material available is too degraded, too mixed, or too compromised by decades of handling to produce results that meet the standard required for definitive identification, a sobering counterpoint to the remarkable successes that DNA technology has achieved in so many other cold cases.